Sarah Martinez had been working as a weapons inspector at the military depot for 3 years, believing her past was buried deep in classified archives, but today felt different as she methodically examined firing pins under the fluorescent lights of Building C. When footsteps echoed behind her, and she turned to see General Harrison approaching with a manila folder in his hands, his expression unreadable as he stopped just close enough for her to notice the red classification stamps bleeding through the paper. The morning had started like any other, with Sarah arriving at the depot before dawn, her thermos of black coffee steaming in the cold air as she badged through the security checkpoints that had become as routine as breathing. But something in the way the guards looked at her today made her skin crawl as if they knew something. She didn't, and when she reached her workstation in the weapons testing facility, she found her usual stack of firing pins had been replaced with a different batch one that bore serial numbers she recognized from a lifetime ago. She had picked up the first firing pin with trembling fingers, trying to convince herself it was just a coincidence, but the weight of it in her palm brought back memories of desert nights and the smell of cordite and blood, and she knew with absolute certainty that someone was sending her a message because these particular firing pins had come from weapons used in Operation Nightfall, the mission that had officially never happened and had left 12 people dead in a compound outside Kandahar. The sound of General Harrison's footsteps grew louder as he approached, and Sarah forced herself to continue her inspection routine even though her heart was hammering against her ribs, because she had spent 3 years perfecting the role of Sarah Martinez, the quiet weapons inspector who lived alone in a small apartment and drove a sensible Honda Civic and had never killed anyone. But now, she could feel her carefully constructed identity beginning to crack like ice under pressure. General Harrison was a man she had never spoken to directly, despite working at his facility for years, but she knew his reputation as someone who had climbed the ranks through political maneuvering rather than battlefield experience, and the way he carried himself suggested he was more comfortable behind a desk than in combat zones, which made his presence in her workspace all the more unsettling, because men like Harrison didn't visit the weapons testing floor unless something had gone very wrong. As he drew closer, Sarah noticed the folder in his hands was thick with documents, and the red classification markings were so dark they seemed to pulse under the harsh lighting, and she realized with growing dread that whatever was in that file was about to destroy the peaceful life she had built for herself, because there was only one reason a general would personally deliver classified documents to a low-level weapons inspector, and that reason involved secrets that were supposed to stay buried forever. The firing pin in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. As memories flooded back of the night, everything went wrong in Afghanistan when her team had been sent to eliminate a high-value target, but had walked into an ambush that left half of them dead and the other half scattered to the winds. And she remembered the weight of her rifle as she had picked off enemy combatants one by one from her position on the ridge, while her teammates fought for their lives in the compound below. She had been known by a different name. Then Lieutenant Elena Vasquez, a sniper with the kind of kill count that made even hardened soldiers uncomfortable, and after Operation Nightfall had gone sideways. The military had offered her a choice between a court-martial for the civilian casualties or a new identity and a quiet job where she could disappear into the bureaucracy and never have to pull a trigger again, and she had chosen the latter, believing she could leave Elena Vasquez buried in the Afghan desert. But now General Harrison was standing 3 feet away from her with what appeared to be her complete service record, and she could see from the thickness of the file that it contained more than just her official military history, because the really dangerous information about Operation Nightfall had been compartmentalized and distributed among only a handful of people who were supposed to take those secrets to their graves. The fluorescent lights above her workstation flickered, creating shadows that seemed to dance across the general's face as he stopped directly in front of her table, and she noticed for the first time that he was wearing a sidearm which was unusual for someone who spent most of his time in administrative meetings, and the weight of his gaze made her feel exposed, as if he could see through her carefully maintained facade to the killer underneath. Sarah set down the firing pin with deliberate care and turned to face him, fully knowing that whatever happened next would determine whether she walked out of Building C as Sarah Martinez, the weapons inspector, or whether Elena Vasquez would have to resurface after. 3 years of dormancy and the thought of returning to that life made her stomach clench with a mixture of fear and something that felt disturbingly like anticipation. The general cleared his throat and she could see sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool temperature in the facility, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of tension that suggested he was about to deliver news that would change everything. And as he began to open the folder, Sarah caught a glimpse of photographs, clipped to the inside cover photographs of faces she recognized from her nightmares, and she knew with absolute certainty that her past had finally caught up with her. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap, and Sarah found herself calculating distances to exits and weapons while maintaining the confused expression of someone who had no idea why a general would be visiting her workstation, but inside her mind, Elena Vasquez was already assessing threats and planning contingencies, because some instincts never fade, no matter how deeply you try to bury them. General Harrison lifted the first page of the file, and Sarah saw her own face staring back at her from a military photograph taken 7 years ago when she still believed in the mission and trusted her superiors, and hadn't yet learned that sometimes the people you kill in the name of freedom are just as innocent as the people you're trying to protect. And the woman in that photograph looked so young and certain of her purpose that Sarah barely recognized her. The general began to speak, and his first words confirmed her worst fears, because he didn't call her Sarah, and he didn't pretend this was a routine visit. Instead, he used the name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years, and suddenly she was no longer a weapons inspector examining firing pins in a sterile government facility, but a soldier again standing at attention while her commanding officer prepared to send her back into the darkness she had fought so hard to escape. The general opened the file without ceremony, revealing pages of her military service record that she thought had been permanently sealed, and as his eyes scanned the heavily redacted sections, his face grew pale. While Sarah felt her carefully constructed civilian life beginning to crumble around her because those black bars covered numbers that told a story she had spent years trying to forget, and now the general was looking at her not as the quiet inspector she had become, but as the operative she used to be. Lieutenant Elena Vasquez, the file read in bold letters across the top of the first page, and beneath it were details that made Sarah's blood run cold because someone had compiled information that should have been scattered across multiple agencies and buried in archives that required presidential clearance to access, and she realized that whoever had put this file together had resources and connections that went far beyond normal military channels, which meant her situation was far worse than she had initially feared. General Harrison turned the first page, and Sarah caught a glimpse of mission reports from operations she had tried to erase from her memory, including detailed accounts of her sniper work in Syria, where she had spent 6 months eliminating targets from distances that most people couldn't even comprehend, and the clinical language of the reports made her kills sound routine and professional. But she remembered the weight of each decision and the faces that still visited her in dreams when her guard was down. The redacted sections were extensive, but not complete, and through the gaps in the black ink, Sarah could see fragments of information that painted a picture of someone who had been very good at killing people. And the general seemed to be reading these fragments with growing unease, as if he was discovering for the first time exactly what kind of person had been working in his facility for the past 3 years, inspecting weapons that she had once used with deadly precision. She watched his expression change as he reached the section about Operation Nightfall, and even though most of the details were blacked out, she could see him processing the implications of what little remained visible, and when he looked up at her, his eyes held a mixture of fear and something that might have been respect, because he was beginning to understand that the quiet woman who had been examining firing pins in his depot was someone who had operated in shadows that most people never knew existed. The fluorescent lights continued to flicker overhead, casting intermittent shadows across the pages as General Harrison turned to a section that made Sarah take an involuntary step backward because she could see photographs clipped to the inside of the folder, and even from her limited vantage point she recognized the faces of people she had killed and people who had tried to kill her. And the fact that someone had collected these images meant they knew exactly who she was and what she had done. General Harrison cleared his throat and began reading from a section that hadn't been completely redacted, and his voice grew quieter as he recited details about her confirmed kills in Afghanistan, including the night when everything went wrong and her team had been ambushed in the compound outside Kandahar, and she had been forced to choose between saving her teammates and maintaining operational security, and the choice she had made still haunted her 3 years later. The kill count was partially visible through the redaction, and Sarah could see that someone had been very thorough in documenting her work, because the numbers included not just confirmed sniper kills, but also close-quarters eliminations and even deaths that had been classified as accidents or collateral damage, and seeing it all compiled in one place made her realize just how much blood was on her hands, and how many people might want revenge. She noticed that General Harrison kept glancing toward the door of Building C as if he was expecting someone else to arrive. And this made her increasingly nervous, because if he had called for backup or additional security, then her options for leaving quietly were rapidly diminishing, and she began to calculate how long it would take her to reach the emergency exit. At the far end of the facility, while wondering if her civilian identity was worth preserving, or if Elena Vasquez needed to resurface immediately. The general turned another page, and Sarah saw a section titled Current Threat Assessment that made her stomach drop, because it suggested that someone had been monitoring her activities for months or possibly years, and had compiled detailed information about her daily routines, her apartment, her grocery shopping habits, and even her interactions with co-workers, and the level of surveillance required for this kind of documentation meant she was dealing with professionals who had significant resources. As he continued reading, Sarah noticed that his hands were shaking slightly, and she realized that General Harrison was not the person who had compiled this file, but rather someone who had been handed information that was far above his security clearance and pay grade, and this meant that whoever was really behind this operation had enough influence to force a general to personally deliver classified documents to a weapons inspector, which suggested a level of power that made her very afraid. The photographs in the file seemed to be organized chronologically, and Sarah caught glimpses of surveillance images that had been taken recently, including shots of her entering and leaving the depot and walking to her car in the parking lot, and the quality of the images suggested professional equipment and trained operators, which meant she had been under observation without knowing it, and this realization made her feel exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced since her military days. General Harrison reached a section that made him stop reading entirely, and when he looked up at her, his expression had changed from nervous uncertainty to something approaching terror, and Sarah realized that he had just discovered information that explained why he had been ordered to deliver this file personally, and whatever he had learned was serious enough to make a career military officer genuinely afraid for his safety. The silence stretched between them as Sarah waited for him to continue reading while her mind raced through possible scenarios and escape routes, because she could see that this meeting was heading toward a conclusion that would force her to make choices she had hoped never to face again, and the weight of her old identity was settling around her shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome coat, she noticed that the general kept checking his watch as if he was operating under a specific timeline, and this suggested that whatever was happening had been carefully orchestrated by people who understood the importance of precise timing and coordination. And Sarah began to suspect that this meeting was not just about revealing her past, but about forcing her into a situation where she would have no choice but to become Elena Vasquez again. The final pages of the file remained unturned, but Sarah could see that they were marked with even higher classification levels than the sections General Harrison had already read, and she realized with growing dread that the worst revelations were yet to come, because whoever had compiled this information had saved the most damaging details for last, and she was about to learn exactly how much her enemies knew about her and what they planned to do with that knowledge. Harrison closed the file slowly and asked her to follow him to his private office, where he revealed that 3 high-value targets from her past missions had recently surfaced and were systematically hunting down everyone involved in Operation Nightfall, including the teammates she thought were safely dead and buried, but apparently someone had been keeping very detailed records of who did what to whom, and now her name was at the top of a very dangerous list. The walk to General Harrison's office felt like a death march as Sarah followed him through corridors she had traversed countless times as a civilian employee, but now every security camera seemed to track her movement, and every guard they passed appeared to be studying her face with newfound interest, and she realized that her cover had been blown so thoroughly that there was no point in maintaining the pretense of being Sarah Martinez, the quiet weapons inspector who had never hurt anyone. General Harrison's office was located on the 3rd floor of the administrative building, and as they climbed the stairs, Sarah noticed that he kept his hand near his sidearm, and his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings as if he expected an attack at any moment. And this level of paranoia from a desk officer suggested that the threat they were dealing with was immediate and deadly and had already claimed victims close enough to home to make everyone nervous. The office itself was spartanly decorated with the usual military memorabilia and commendations, but Sarah immediately noticed that the blinds were drawn tight and there were additional locks on the door that hadn't been there during her previous brief visits to deliver inspection reports, and when General Harrison activated what appeared to be a signal jamming device. She realized that whatever he was about to tell her was sensitive enough to require complete electronic isolation. He gestured for her to sit in the chair across from his desk, but Sarah remained standing because Elena Vasquez had learned long ago that sitting down in potentially hostile situations was a luxury that could get you killed, and she positioned herself where she could see both the door and the window while keeping her hands free and her weight balanced on the balls of her feet, ready to move in any direction. General Harrison opened the file again and turned to a section near the back that contained photographs of 3 men whose faces made Sarah's blood freeze because she recognized them immediately as targets she had failed to eliminate during Operation Nightfall, and seeing them alive after all these years meant that her worst fears about that mission had been confirmed, and the people she had been sent to kill were not only still breathing but actively seeking revenge. The first photograph showed Dmitry Kozlov, a former Spetsnaz operative who had been selling weapons to insurgent groups in Afghanistan, and Sarah remembered the night she had him in her crosshairs from 800 meters away, but had been forced to abort the shot when civilians entered her field of fire, and she had assumed that other assets would complete the mission. But apparently Kozlov had escaped and had spent the intervening years building a network of contacts and resources that made him extremely dangerous. The second photograph was of Hassan al-Rashid, a bomb maker who had been responsible for dozens of attacks on coalition forces, and Sarah had tracked him to a compound outside Kandahar where she had been part of the assault team that was supposed to capture or kill him. But the mission had gone sideways when they walked into an ambush, and in the chaos that followed, al-Rashid had vanished like smoke. and she had never learned whether he had been killed or had escaped until now. The third photograph made her stomach clench with recognition because it showed Viktor Petrov, a Russian intelligence officer who had been coordinating with Taliban forces to target American operations, and Sarah had actually wounded him during a firefight in the mountains, but had been forced to withdraw when her position was compromised, and she had always wondered if he had survived the blood loss. And now she had her answer, and it was clear that he had not only survived but had spent years planning his revenge. General Harrison explained that all three men had recently surfaced in various locations around the world, and intelligence agencies had begun tracking their movements only to discover that they were systematically eliminating everyone who had been involved in Operation Nightfall, and the kill list they were working from was disturbingly accurate and complete, which suggested they had access to classified information that should have been impossible to obtain. The first victim had been Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, who had been found dead in his apartment in San Diego 3 months ago, and the official cause of death was listed as a heart attack. But the autopsy had revealed traces of an exotic poison that was favored by certain Eastern European intelligence services, and when investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Torres had been under surveillance for weeks before his death. The second victim was Captain Jennifer Walsh, who had been killed in what appeared to be a random mugging in Washington, D.C., but the level of violence used against her suggested personal motivation rather than simple robbery, and security footage from nearby buildings showed that her attackers had been professionals who knew exactly how to avoid cameras and leave minimal forensic evidence. The third victim was Lieutenant Colonel David Chen, who had died in a car accident in Colorado that investigators now believed had been staged because the brake lines on his vehicle had been cut with surgical precision, and witnesses reported seeing a van following his car for several miles before the crash, and the occupants of that van had never been identified. Despite an extensive investigation, General Harrison revealed that each of these deaths had initially been classified as unrelated incidents, but a pattern had emerged when intelligence analysts began cross-referencing the victims and discovered that all three had been part of the same classified operation, and this had triggered a review of everyone who had been involved in Operation Nightfall, which was how Sarah's current identity had been compromised. The most disturbing revelation was that the three targets had somehow obtained detailed personnel files for everyone involved in the mission, including current addresses, employment information, and family details, and this suggested that they had either infiltrated government databases or had been provided with inside information by someone with high-level security clearance. Sarah realized with growing horror that if these men had her current identity, then they also knew where she lived and worked, and had probably been watching her for weeks or months while planning their approach, and the fact that she was still alive meant either that they were saving her for last, or that they had something special planned for the person who had come closest to killing them. General Harrison explained that the FBI and CIA were now working together to track down the three targets, but their investigation had been hampered by the fact that all three men were highly trained professionals with extensive experience in evading law enforcement, and they had clearly spent years preparing for this operation and had resources and connections that made them extremely difficult to locate. The general paused and looked directly at Sarah before revealing the most chilling detail of all, which was that intelligence intercepts had indicated that the three targets were not working alone, but were part of a larger network that included other survivors from various black operations who had banded together to hunt down the people who had tried to kill them. And this meant that Sarah was not just dealing with three vengeful enemies, but with an entire organization dedicated to settling old scores. As General Harrison finished his briefing, Sarah realized that her peaceful life as a weapons inspector was over, and that Elena Vasquez would have to resurface whether she wanted to or not, because the alternative was waiting passively for professional killers to come for her, and she had not survived this long by being passive when her life was threatened. As Sarah sat in stunned silence, the general slid a new assignment across his desk, explaining that her cover as a weapons inspector was about to become very real because the depot was the next target, and she was the only one who knew these enemies well enough to stop them. But what he didn't tell her was that the person who leaked her location was sitting in the room next door, listening to every word and already making plans to ensure she would never leave the building alive. The assignment folder was marked with classifications that Sarah hadn't seen since her military days, and as she opened it, she discovered detailed schematics of the weapons depot along with intelligence. Reports suggesting that Kozlov, al-Rashid, and Petrov were planning to infiltrate the facility within the next 48 hours with the goal of stealing advanced weapons technology that could be sold to the highest bidder, and the timing of their attack had been carefully coordinated to coincide with a scheduled shipment of experimental ammunition that would arrive tomorrow morning. General Harrison explained that the depot contained prototypes of next-generation weapon systems, including smart ammunition that could adjust its trajectory mid-flight and armor-piercing rounds that could penetrate any known defensive material, and if these weapons fell into the wrong hands, they could shift the balance of power in conflicts around the world and create a black market arms race that would destabilize entire regions. Sarah studied the intelligence reports and realized that the 3 targets had done their homework because they knew exactly when security would be lightest and which entry points would be most vulnerable, and their plan showed a level of sophistication that suggested they had inside information about the depot's operations and security protocols, which meant someone with access to classified information was feeding them details. The general revealed that Sarah would be working with a small team of specialists who had been briefed on her background and were prepared to follow her lead in defending the facility. But as he spoke, Sarah noticed that his eyes kept darting toward the door, and his voice carried an undertone of nervousness that suggested he was not telling her everything about the situation. In the room next door, Deputy Director Marcus Webb sat with his ear pressed to a listening device that allowed him to hear every word of the conversation taking place in General Harrison's office, and as he listened to the briefing, he smiled coldly because everything was proceeding exactly according to his plan, and Sarah Martinez had no idea that she was walking into a trap that had been months in the making. Webb had been the one who leaked Sarah's location to Kozlov and his associates because he had his own reasons for wanting Elena Vasquez eliminated and using her former targets to accomplish this goal, provided him with perfect deniability while also removing several loose ends that could potentially expose his own involvement in illegal arms deals that had been funding his lavish lifestyle for the past 5 years. The deputy director had carefully orchestrated the entire situation, including the discovery of the 3 targets and the intelligence reports that suggested they were planning to attack the depot, and he had even arranged for the experimental weapons shipment to be scheduled for tomorrow morning because he knew that Sarah would never be able to resist the opportunity to stop her former enemies from obtaining advanced military technology. As General Harrison continued his briefing, Webb checked his watch and confirmed that the timeline was proceeding as planned because Kozlov and his team were already in position around the depot and would begin their assault as soon as Sarah took her position in the facility, and the beauty of the plan was that everyone would assume she had died heroically defending the weapons cache, when in reality she would be eliminated by the very people she had once tried to kill. Sarah asked General Harrison about the security team that would be supporting her, and he provided her with personnel files for 3 specialists who appeared to have impressive credentials, but what he didn't mention was that all 3 men were actually working for Webb and had been instructed to ensure that Sarah did not survive the coming confrontation regardless of whether the depot was successfully defended. The general handed Sarah a secure communication device and explained that she would be in constant contact with the command center during the operation, but the device had been modified by Webb's technicians to transmit her exact location to Kozlov and his team, while also allowing Webb to monitor her communications and ensure that she received no warning about the trap that was closing around her. As the briefing concluded, Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, because despite her reservations about returning to her former life, she could not allow advanced weapons technology to fall into the hands of terrorists and arms dealers, and she knew that her unique knowledge of the three targets made her the best qualified person to stop them, even if it meant risking everything she had built as Sarah Martinez. General Harrison stood and shook, her hand with what appeared to be genuine respect and concern. But Sarah noticed that his palm was sweating, and his grip was firmer than necessary, as if he was trying to convince himself that he was doing the right thing, and she began to suspect that there were aspects of this operation that he either didn't know about or was deliberately concealing from her. In the adjacent room, Webb was already making final preparations for the operation, including confirming that the experimental weapons shipment contained tracking devices that would allow him to recover the technology after Kozlov and his team eliminated Sarah and stole the cash because he had no intention of allowing the weapons to remain in terrorist hands when he could sell them himself for 10 times their development cost. As Sarah left General Harrison's office and headed back to her workstation to prepare for what might be her final mission, she had no idea that every step she took was being monitored by people who wanted her dead, and that the depot she was preparing to defend had already been compromised by the very people who were supposed to be protecting it, and that her chances of surviving the next 24 hours were virtually non-existent.